Hello and welcome. Come on down, plenty of seats in the front. Thank you all for coming out tonight on what's not an exceptionally wonderful weather, but nonetheless I think the talks will make up for the weather problems. This is the third night of Emerging Voices, and we are delighted to be celebrating Schaum, Shieh, and Yufi tonight. And I am Paul Lewis, the president of the Architectural League. And just by way of explanation, to let you know that Emerging Voices is a juried, portfolio-based kind of competition where the goal is really to identify 8 practitioners. They can be in architecture, and they can be in landscape, they can be in urbanism. But the important thing is that they're produced a voice, a legible voice, and are either in the process of having any impact on those disciplines or have the future prospect of doing so. So this is the 36th season, if you will, of the lectures, and the first 30 years are encapsulated in a book entitled Idea, Form, and Residence, which is available. And my first thanks tonight goes out to Anne Rieselbach, the League's program director, who's really been responsible for the continued vitality. It's amazing that it's in the 36th season of Emerging Voices. Also, on behalf of the League, I want to thank principal supporters, Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown, who are here tonight, who make the Emerging Voices series possible. Additional support for the series is provided by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and the New York State Council on the Arts, and by the League's Next Generation Fund, which consists of contributions from past Emerging Voices and also League Prize winners. Now, tonight's pairing is an interesting pairing. I should mention that the logistics of the pairing are really a product of travel schedules, not based on necessarily a kind of matching between the content of the two speakers. And in fact, one could argue that these two speakers are distinctly different, which actually allows for a kind of wonderful pairing, if you will. There's obvious differences of location. Yufi is coming from Toronto by way of Tokyo, and Schaum, Shieh are located in both Houston and New York. But more importantly, there's a difference in terms of the focus of their work. Yufi's largest built work is engaged in high-end global retail. There's an attention towards obsessive, kind of almost bespoke details, where Schaum, Shieh is in effect rethinking American urbanity through inventive buildings that are often based on conventional materials that are seeking effects of program, mass, and volume. One identifies nature as the catalyst for the work, where the other claims that the work is focused on the urban. Yet, it was interesting for me to read the coverage of the Emerging Voices in the Architect's newspaper, and I want to shout out to the Architect's newspaper for the extensive coverage. It's fantastic to get it each year. But the articles on Schaum, Shieh, and Yufi conclude with these 2 sentences. One is, the work somehow produces some kind of surprise. And the other was, the work testifies to the firm's ability to surprise with an economy of means regardless of locale. So, for the sake of the illusion of coordination, I'm going to use the logic of surprise as the basis of both of these introductions. Okay, so first, it's my pleasure to introduce Troy Schaum and Rosalyne Shieh, who have been working together since 2009. It's important to note that both Troy and Rosalyne are both very active teachers, Rice and MIT respectively, and that they are among the most interesting young faculty who fluidly move between academic exploration and research through the role of physical buildings. As the jury noted, they have a super interesting body of completed projects through the specifics of nuanced shape, idiosyncratic yet pragmatic forms. They alchemically transform tight budgets and conventional materials into transcendent buildings. But what is equally surprising and potentially more powerful about the work is that the engagement with the building is not about the building as an autonomous object, but as a means to transform larger urban areas. These buildings work as active forms in the urban context in unexpected and surprising ways. Moreover, what is also interesting is that they seem to be involved in a host of American building types, While professions tend to kind of force a degree of specialization, they have built a gallery, a house, a music hall, a collection of townhouses, and a renovated strip mall, just to name a few. Each of these types are but a starting point for more complex internal programmatic hybrids, which then often ripple out into the space beyond the building to impact the urban and to affect the collective. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating Troy Schaum and Rosalyne Shieh.
I do want to say that Troy and I met in Paul's studio at school, grad school. So thank you. Hello to everyone. Thanks, and thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Thank you also to Anne and the selection committee for the invitation to speak as part of this series, and to everyone at the Architectural League, in particular, Katrina, for working with us so helpfully and graciously in this process. We are really pleased to be part of this and honored to be here. So I'm going to start off the talk, and then Troy and I will hand it back and forth and talk about different projects, and then Troy is going to close. So this idea of blanking. This term blanking is one that we've landed on because of the notion of blanks, which is used in metal fabrication, like blank keys, in which material is shaped approximately to be later formed into unique objects. Similarly, we have some interests that have emerged in our work that we use as approximate containers for recurring ideas and interests that we visit and revisit, but also are adapted as we continue our practice, engage new ideas, and do new kinds of work. Another play off this term is the notion of blanking at the blank page. In fact, no project begins without content or intent. No project you don't really start from truly a blank place. But in fact, we project ideas from the beginning, in effect finding some of what interests us within it. So this is how we found this is how we found the recurrent ideas or interests in our work to be like blanks, specific but soft around the edges and open to change. And the development of work itself is an adaptation of hunches into specific responses, specific interventions, and unique findings. Part of this is an ongoing process of the formation of a common language by which we can define and propel the work. And specifically, one of the things that we've started to do is to kind of name ideas in a series of terms. These terms become semi-specific containers for ideas, and they are not so much definitions as they are vectors defined by somewhat leading questions. This vocabulary of soft terms, or our current set of blanks from which we attempt to define and propel our projects, and in the case of this talk today, attempt to organize our projects around certain ideas about building, aesthetics, representation, people, the city, and other things we care about that are more explicitly architectural. And so we're trying something here, and hopefully it works, to introduce and intersperse this presentation of our work with some of these terms to situate the ideas within a broader frame. So we have had the opportunity to work and think in Detroit, Marfa, and Houston. And while each of these places is quite distinct in their physical, climatic, and social conditions, they share a kind of remoteness. Whether remote because, like Marfa, they are actually quite hard to get to, or remoteness because their ideal form is less understood or known, and the notion of ideals might in fact be nonsensical in these places. What we have been focused on are things like the leakiness of these urban conditions, the dispersion of some of these landscapes, the informal quality of these places. For us, these conditions are grouped under the idea of entropy, where the things that look one way might be open to many interpretations, and where the appropriate interventions are not always self-evident. And as a response, we have returned often to this image, which is taken from the Eiffel Tower, looking down. What we see are people running across the open space, waiting to get in, talking, sitting on benches. The ground is the picture plane in this point of view. The people are unevenly distributed but ordered, you can trace lines and identify directional clumps and legible elements. In the shadow of the tower, in a way, the form of the tower is a subject of the photo, even though the tower itself is not in the photo. What is foregrounded in this photo is not the city or architecture as artifact, but its activity or a moment in its life or process. We're interested in how building organizes or makes possible these processes, or to put it another way, and to paraphrase Robert Smithson, we are also interested in how building collaborates with entropy and how that produces localized order or platforms that can support different modes of inhabitation, use, and other things that are harder to predict. So, like I said, the ground is a kind of picture plane. In this point of view, the lines are lines. And so the image becomes a model for representation or a kind of drawing by which we can visualize these ideas. In Detroit, this idea of entropy was paired with one of blankness, or the void, where we were trying to see the spaces left by the removal. And what you can't see very well, because the image is so dark, is it's actually a lot that is empty because of the removal of a house between two houses, which is framed in the center. So we're trying to see the spaces that are left by removal is not defined by lack, to resist the propositions that re-densification is revival, but to see the spaces as pointing towards a possible different outcome.
So this project is very important in the development of the ideas in our firm, because it really did emerge in a moment when our firm was a blank page back in 2009, which was the kind of bottom of the recession that many of you probably remember. And so we were using this kind of project that was a mix between a research-based project and a making project to rethink how we could look at the void and use some of the tools that we have been developing and talking about today to flip the idea of seeing the void as a kind of vacancy to seeing the void as a kind of prepared site. And if we could actually see figure and ground somehow as a potentiality and not to see the kind of city or the imagination of the ruined Detroit that was especially in the foreground of the conversation then as so much as a problem to be solved, but as a kind of potentiality that exists across urban systems, or to put it another way, could we imagine Detroit as a paradigmatic urban condition of space? And so we did this by actually starting by using a diagram and producing a series of diagrams that, and I won't go into the details, but that try to switch the understanding of the space from organized along streets and blocks to actually multi-directional fields. And if we could look at the kind of erosion of the block and of the urban fabric through the lens of this kind of multi-directional field, we could develop a strategy where we could insert these really small-scale objects in what we call the kind of what we call the kind of minor diagram to produce a series of infrastructures that could support the neighborhood and support the activity there. This was developed for a publication called Architecture is All Over that was published by Columbia University last year. But this, in this project, you can see even the way we drew it, in this case, a perspective much like the perspective from the image of the Eiffel Tower, actually cutting away the roofs and rethinking the city from the foreground and the background actually collapsing. So it operates something more like what we imagined was a kind of sponge, and we called this project Sponge Urbanism. And this project was both an idea to kind of demonstrate, but also we wanted to make it an idea to kind of test a series of ideas. And so we actually got together with a group of people at Michigan, that most of whom call themselves Team now. You guys might know, some of you. Does this work? And we purchased this house with the group for $500. This is the house. And the house next door actually had burned down. You can see it's fire damaged here in the image. And working with some local arts groups, we developed an idea. Everyone took a piece of the house, and we took this one piece in the front of the house to again, look at the kind of reorientation of the house in this kind of cross-diagonal axis. In this case, we were designing something that would be a kind of theater for projection, or maybe a theater for like small readings that could work when that fire-damaged house gets torn down actually there would be this kind of park that would emerge, and also would bring light into the space. So we built this up out of a series of CNC plywood panels that we fabricated and then covered with a light scrim that created both a kind of ladder or a ramp to bring you up into the second floor, and also to bring light down like a lantern into the house below. And you can see there was even this kind of moment at the roof that's a giant slumped piece of plexiglass that would let you look out across the rooftops and look at the kind of reordered city beyond. Here you can see the kind of axis up through the roof and the way it brings light and movement down through the project. So we were asked almost a few months after completing this project, we were asked by David Chipperfield in the 13th International Architecture Biennale in Venice to actually all of us were asked to reimagine this project. In this case, though, we couldn't rely on the context, say like the house, to actually support or react against the project because we were working in a 15th century rope factory, which you guys all probably know, the Arsenale. And we couldn't touch the walls or really any part of the project. So we began to look at how a series of parts or pieces could form a kind of assemblage that would actually construct some of its own context. In this case, these 23 fiberglass composite pieces that we produced, and you can see here kind of laid out on the floor of the Arsenale, were shipped from Michigan and assembled into the kind of object you see on the right. It was made out of that began partly as another material experimentation that we won't go into that much today, but it was produced using a bioresin that was developed for surfboard production in California for surfers that wanted to feel better about their use of carbon. And this is Rosalyne fabricating the pieces now. And it produced this kind of, again, lantern-like form, in this case freestanding. But you were still able to actually move up through it and actually kind of play in it and even like escape the relentless floor of the Biennale exhibit. In this case, we also used a kind of color, a kind of salmon color, that kind of animated the project in the dark spaces of the Arsenale. And here you can see some people escaping up into the rafters, and you could actually get quite high and cantilevered quite far out into the kind of rafters above the project. And so this idea of thinking about parts and assemblages to construct the context or to react to these spaces of dispersion is something we got to explore in other projects. I'm just going to very quickly talk about this. This is a project we did in Richmond, Virginia, with a series of a group of graphic design and fashion design and interior design students from VCU. And we made a series of these objects that they were able to rearrange into kind of a wall in an old alley, or actually create a kind of reterritorialization of the alley itself. And what was kind of interesting in working with them as an anecdote is the students really didn't make things like architecture students do. They wanted to mostly sew things. So these are all forms that are made of cardboard and then wrapped with these kind of jackets of color that were all sewn by the fashion design students. But it created this really kind of vibrant color. And so this idea of pieces that actually start to produce a kind of ecosystem of meaning through their self-similar relationships became something that we began to explore in many of our projects. And it became a way for us, something that Paul mentioned in the introduction, as a kind of active form, making and active forms in the making became a way that we began to structure a way to react to the kind of city of dispersion or the kind of city of space that we found ourselves working in.
And then so some of those parts come together in single active forms or single bodies or objects, and then sometimes we think about these parts or these pieces as aggregating into these assemblages that might negotiate with each other, but also with the context, and then how it is that they start to construct environments and atmospheres. And so if PS1, that just going to show one slide of that, becomes a kind of tableau or a stage for different kinds of performances, we're also interested in this idea of a stage with places to kind of hide and emerge from very small moments to more grand moments. And also in the way that a stage as something that has a direction and produces a kind of act of revealing. It implicates a moving body or a moving subject. It can also be a way of organizing a site. And this is a speculative project for our pop music center in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, that we did with Albert Pope. And in this project, we were interested in this kind of interplay between movement and form and program and landscape, and thinking about the kind of transitions and like the relationships conducted between them as these kinds of moments of like revealing, as you walked through, you kind of move through, the circulation moves through the project, and how they are constructed together. So it's situated, the project is situated at an old waterfront edge and at the end of a river. And it was more landscape than building. So the challenge for us was to have a strategy that could foreground openness and landscape while also directing the distribution of building form and how to bring those together within a context in a manner that both filtered circulation in, as well as bringing people through in a way that was considered. So we used a grid of 50-meter spheres as a way of organizing the site and bridging the building scale with the landscape scale. The spheres are a mediating representation that organize metrics and set a kind of granularity in order to align movement and to make spatial relationships. It became a kind of generative tool for us to mediate the existing conditions and the projected realities. And it was a way of using a single drawing to manage a wide range of criteria, not unlike the master minor diagram from Sponge Urbanism. And so here you can see how these different parts relate. The drawings and diagrams set loose but deliberate internal relationships between the different criteria along a kind of circulatory infrastructural path that links different districts of the city. And it was also a way of thinking through program along the itinerary as it overlapped building and open space. And so here you can see kind of a proto-diagram plan of how it's coming together. And from front to back, these become visible, these kind of different parts become visible as layers that are kind of, laminated together, kind of estuary, in this case, the estuary, the beach, the water plaza, the buildings, and then the landforms, and then the city beyond, and a kind of way of compressing all of those things together. The render for us is a way to, in the project, to kind of test or project the immersive result of the project, the whole of which would not be something you would ever experience, or like you would never be able to see it and all its parts at ground level. And so I was trying to test it as a kind of like atmospheric kind of palimpsest. And the buildings themselves are kind of episodic within the broader field of the project. And then here you can see a night view where the water reflection of the water becomes active, and then a kind of surface that registers in a different way. And then the buildings kind of form this tight edge around this downtown, so we're imagining a kind of lot of activity flowing into this space.
And so for us, this was a real breakthrough in thinking about the notion of a kind of peripatetic or a moving subject they could both carve the forms of the building and also begin to structure a site. So we explored this again. This is a model we made for a competition that we lost to Sana and a lot of other people, I guess. But but that looked at combining a library and an art museum in Taichung, Taiwan, in which the kind of colorful parts became the art museum that dropped out, and there was kind of a banding or wrapping that engaged the park. We also explored this in a series of research projects that Rosalyne and I did in Taiwan. This is an imagination of a kind of trajectory or line that's in a bike hostel in Alishan, Taiwan, between the tea plantations and the tall cedar forest in the Taiwanese mountains. And that this idea of a kind of moving subject that could move against the landscape and actually carve building forms and landscape forms is something that we actually got to test, and this project is actually just getting the stakes from the surveyors now in Virginia. This is a home for an anthropologist and a playwright in the mountains of Virginia, and with the imagination that it could become a kind of playwriting retreat, a kind of like one-person MacDowell colony when the couple decides not to live there anymore. So in this case, we had a very steep site along the Blue Ridge Mountain, and we began to look at how a series of objects or a series of forms actually strung along this kind of line could flip-flop or kind of move downhill or uphill back and forth against the grain to produce things that were more nested or embedded in the landscape, or things that were more open and more exposed to the view. You can see, so there's this kind of 120-foot long hallway where things like the kind of bathrooms and the guest rooms, dining, this is another guest room, actually kind of get embedded into the landscape, and the spaces that the clients really wanted to foreground, like spaces like the bedroom, the kitchen, which is very important to one of our clients especially. I guess one likes to cook and one likes to eat, so I guess it's important to both of them. And also the kind of living spaces. And it produced this kind of rhythm also between the kind of intimacy of the gardens in that landscape. So you might think that the distraction of the kind of mega view is the kind of most important aspect of the project, but the kind of intimacy of these gardens that are surrounded on three sides, and then the buildings that are surrounded on three sides by these garden landscape spaces kind of string along through the project. And here you can see the kind of string of these spaces that would look out towards the view along this kind of telescoping path that you move through. And so you can see this is the kind of moment where you look across the gardens and the kind of outdoor spaces from room to garden to room to garden to room to garden as you look along the project. And of course, you could look out to these sweeping views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And so you would think that a kind of losing competition for a pop music complex would be maybe the only time you get the opportunity to work on a pop music complex. But actually, shortly after that competition, we were approached by a couple of very young, in their early 30s, music lovers and entrepreneurs in Houston, Texas, to develop a project there for them. And through a series talking about blank, we were all very blank at that moment, I guess. We were a very naive young firm. I guess we still are naive, less young. But we made some sketches for them for almost no money and thought that they would go away and never talk to them again. But they showed up 6 months later and they had the land secured and they had the funds to start the project. And this became essentially a 5-acre music venue in Houston. You can see its proximity to downtown. It's one of the only ground-up music venues of its kind that I've ever heard of, because most rock and roll venues, if you're in a place like New York, you have the great old metropolitan fabric of the 19th century that you somehow inhabit in old warehouses and breweries or whatever. In Houston, you have to still build these things. So this is a how do you build something that's going to have authenticity, that's not an old pier or old warehouse, is something that became very important to us. For us, the kind of engagement with the landscape, this is along the bayou, as you can see here, which is it's a river. I don't know why they call them bayous in Houston, but they do. They're really rivers, and the bayou has a very lots of like mosquito-ridden connotations. But anyway, there's a river here, which Houston is in the process, like a lot of cities, of returning to its riverfronts and thinking about the ecology. And it was situated within the views of downtown. This is a place that we had to investigate what it is to kind of construct an urbanism from almost ground up in Houston, with a few remnants of what was there, but inserting new things almost surgically. And so there's a kind of main venue, we call it, that has 2 stages. There's an outdoor amphitheater for about 4,500 people. There's an existing building that Rosalyne's going to talk a little bit about that's was built as a conversation piece in the 1970s that kind of stayed, that has 2 stages in it. And all of these things had to seam together in a way that we could actually think about this question of what we call sinfulness, that actually comes from Mark Weiss's discussions of ubiquitous computing, but how you can think of things that could exist semi-autonomously and actually make the seams between them something you actually kind of celebrate and experience, but in a way that's not necessarily a kind of hindrance. And so we began to reflect on this idea of sinfulness and stitch these things together. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that what characterizes White Oak, that, a lot of this is like kind of post, after the project, thinking about it and thinking about what has happened and what the effects are. And so sometimes we think about these things and there are things that we realize after the fact. But there's lots of kind of unlike pieces, and we dealt with them kind of one by one, kind of incrementally as we had to. And like one of the things I think that is characteristic of this project is that it is kind of feathered into the neighborhood that surrounds it, and it is a kind of like outcome of the piecemeal way in which the parts were kind of added to each other in the incremental way in which we had to kind of develop the project. And there's a lot of kind of disjunctions that are here, and one of the ideas around a kind of sinfulness is to let disjunctions be disjunct. And I think what's interesting about it is that even though it's kind of, you can think about it as a kind of single campus, it is actually open and starts to occupy different pieces that already existed. And so it has a way of existing within the context by kind of taking over pieces that is more enmeshed, I think. And that seems to me a kind of outcome of the way in which the project came together. So the largest piece, as Troy mentioned, is this new building that houses 2 indoor music venues right here in this perspective. And you can see that there's an outdoor stage that is also a kind of another piece that is part of the set of pieces. And one of the major moves that we were undertaking or trying to do is to structure a relationship between the bayou. So if you look at this little section here, between the bayou, the new main building, and then the downtown views, and that kind of compression to perceptually structure the spaces such that you would have a kind of intimate crowd experience, but at the scale of the entire city. And so kind of reaching out and grabbing the skyline, kind of, let's say, as a way to feel both small and big. So the venue has 5 stages, and you can see 3 of them. You can see 3 of them here. The main indoor venue, which is the big one. Oh, you got the pointer. Good. The main indoor venue, the small indoor venue, and then you can see the terraces, and then the outdoor venue, and then you can see the terraces that create a relationship to the exterior. So it's kind of like this nested relationship, I think. So the project actually involved a very extensive reconstruction of the site. We rebuilt sidewalks and sewer lines. We closed a street that led to nowhere. That sounds interesting, huh? And substantially regraded the site to support the amphitheater program, as well as to accommodate a new detention basin under the outdoor deck of the Raven Tower Ice House, which I'll show you in a second. The process of construction also uncovered an old low water bridge that used to cross the bayou, and which we found remnants of. So here you can see the main venue finished, the rise of the amphitheater, some of the lawn furniture in the front there, and then the main entrance, which is right under the sign. So we thought of the building as supporting an audience and being defined as much by its internal venues as being on the outside, a series of places for people to gather and watch the outdoor show. So from these, you can see the hanging polycarbonate balconies, the covered roof deck. These are all places for people to stand and look out towards the main stage, the covered roof deck, and then the outdoor furniture are also places for them to gather. And then sandwiched between that lawn and the building is a circulation path that threads alongside it and through the site, as well as allowing you access up and down from the balconies. And this is the main indoor venue, which is shaped like a tall volumetric room. The balcony is quite close to the stage in a way that makes you feel like you're right on top of the performers. And it's a kind of compression that gives a kind of intimate feeling. And these wood slats that line this venue, the larger venue, all the bands have different spacing to ensure that no notes are dropped. We worked with Jaffe Holden out of Connecticut to develop this. And behind the slats is 2,000 square feet of rock wool insulation, which helps to absorb the sound. The result is a space in which an unamplified voice maintains richness and sounds really good.
Yeah, this was, I just want to jump in because this is like the real rock and roll kind of moment, because we were working with the production crew and the roadies and all the people that actually put on these shows, and we learned a lot about how that actually works. And we would argue with them a lot because they're not actually very concerned with aesthetics at all. If you can think of most of the clubs you go to see good music, they don't look like this. And so after going like toe-to-toe with these guys, very tough guys for like mostly men for a long time, they called us the day of the show. They did the first sound check, and the guy was like, I almost cried because I don't know what you guys did with these guys from Connecticut, but it's like one of the best sounding rooms that I've set up. So anyway, we had some successes that way. And it's become, what's nice about this and all the seriousness with which you talk about it in the city is it's really become a place that I meet people all over town. It's a moment where a public can kind of emerge, and they say like this has like become a kind of temple for them to hear the music that didn't really have a place in Houston before. And anyway, we don't have time to go into the politics of that, but it's really interesting. It's an independent venue that's not managed by Live Nation. I'll just put it that way.
Okay, so here it is, occupied. And across behind, well, you saw where we pointed out the ice house. So this is Raven Tower, the conversation piece, and the shed in front of it is the ice house. And while the main venue was under construction, the clients wanted a way to keep their employees employed, as well as to continue earning revenue and putting on shows. So this is adjacent to the lawn. The Raven Tower and this shed used to belong to a local metal worker. His name is R.W. Walker, whose daughter told us the thing about the conversation piece. But so as a way of moving quickly and also to save on MEP costs, we turned it into an outdoor venue by just cutting holes in it. I mean, it was a little more complicated than that, but we cut some holes in it. And so here's a picture of Troy on a ladder. That's you, right?
Yeah.
As we're projecting the shapes onto the side. Are you tracing it?
Yeah.
So tracing it with a what?
With a Sharpie.
It's a high-tech operation. Troy shape, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then we're cutting them out. So for us, in thinking about these kind of unlike parts of the project, it's like a combination between found objects, I think, and then also new constructions. And like the way in which we were trying to think about them as all kind of fitting into a single category is this: we totally dissolved the kind of divide between new construction and kind of natural landscape, and think about the whole city as a kind of geology that includes natural formations where buildings are also kind of natural formations. So just a few images that we really like of the project. Kind of this one we didn't, it was taken by a journalist, but the kind of forms that dissolve into the night, into the looseness of the surroundings of the night, and also the kind of looseness of the surrounding context of Houston, and a kind of inversion of space and building as evidenced in this photo. And then the way in which it presses up against the street edge and mingles with the electrical cables is like a particularly, that's a favorite image of ours. But also we find the project in the pictures that are taken that then we then look at and then see the project anew.
It's really hard. I just want to say, it's really hard when you see an image like this. I mean, this is the city that we work in Houston, and there's lots of moments like this in New York too, but it's hard to take yourself seriously when you're composing an elevation against this kind of urban infrastructure. And so, this is a building that's made out of hardy board that's been ripped into 2 foot by 8 foot pieces, and then the overlap is 1 foot 10 inches, and the hardy board is what most of Houston is made out of, and so there's a kind of Paul mentioned as an introduction, a kind of cheap and cheerful way in which a lot of this work has to happen in that context, and so these kind of bold geologic forms are one way we kind of bridge that divide.
And then just the last image that I'll show of White Oak, which is kind of, we enjoy it when it kind of drops back as is kind of like landform behind the activity that itself becomes a kind of spectacle in front of it.
Okay, so this is the last project we're going to talk about, and it's gotten published a lot, so maybe you guys have seen it, but I don't know why. But anyway, so it's we actually officed in this space. This is a purpose-built photography studio that had 16-foot ceilings, and we were officing in this space. And our landlord is a really interesting woman named Serpic Angelini that was interested in the intersection between anthropology and art. And she was interested in, and she has been for a long time, supporting and curating art projects that look at ethnographic practice and reflect on art that reflects on its own making. And so she came to us with that idea of like, can I make an institution for that? Or a space that can house that institution, and somewhere between actually an institution. And she grew up in Venezuela in a moment in Venezuela's history when there were these kind of residential salons that would support art and conversation around art. And so this is somewhere between a kind of house and a kind of gallery, in that it's not it's not a commercial gallery. And so the gallery itself, to the extent that it's a gallery, is broken up into these two spaces. There's a kind of space in the back that has a kind of service wall that's to support things like performance art or new media. There's a space in the front. They're almost perfect cubes, but not quite, that is more light-filled and closer to the public and more like what you might imagine a traditional art gallery. And there's this kind of spine or core in the center that supports a lot of the activity that she imagined in this space, including a space for 10,000 volumes of books that she wanted to move into the space on art and anthropology, a space to have meetings with anthropologists or artists, and a place for her to write and have meetings. And this is the space in the back that now used to be our office, and we have a equally cool office now, but that is now a space that supports local artists that are preparing shows. And so the project exists right at the edge of the Manila campus, very close to the Rothko Chapel, and so it's surrounded by these kind of iconic, very strong monumental projects in the city. But those projects also operate in a kind of domestic scale as well, which I think is a really interesting thing about how these kind of important institutions in Houston deal with that problem. And so we were trapped between how do we think about this kind of city of space that we're working in, and also how do we think about this problem of monumentality in an institution like this in a way to break that down. And we came back to this idea of panels, and we originally imagined these were going to be actually machined GFRC panels, but we couldn't quite afford that in the end. But and using a kind of system of panelization that would produce this kind of relationships across the facade that would start to construct its own kind of context in this space. This is a gravel lot that's adjacent that I'll show you in a minute. But and so this is the building as it's completed, and you can see this is the volume in the front. It's the traditional gallery, and the volume in the back, and this is the kind of entry in the roof deck. The building was originally imagined as a steel building, but we couldn't find anybody who would actually bid a reasonable price for such a small steel building. So we actually, in a kind of piece of serendipity, re-engineered it all out of this heavy timber. So it's actually a heavy timber construction. This is all LVLs. It's quite, some of these cuts, it's hard to imagine maybe, but are quite structurally complex. But it was built like a barn with, lots of manual labor, kind of lifting these beams into place and constructing into place. The other thing we imagined, I mentioned the CNC idea of the panels. We thought, well, at least these windows would have to be constructed in some sort of, using the tools that we all know in this room, we can use today. But in the context of the place where we work in Houston, what the fabricators actually did was just take the beamer and beam them onto the wall from our construction drawings and just trace them on the wall and built the frames to that shape. And then these are basically artisans, but they're the sheet metal guys. And they fabricated some of these details that you might have seen on site as sheet metal details. The nice thing about the wood construction is it actually let us carve some of the detailing that you see into the structure so that we could accommodate it with the sheet metal. And so you get these this is the facade to West Alabama, which is the main street. It's both, in a way, kind of this strong form set of panels, but actually has this kind of softness and peels back. On the interior, you can see the programs kind of stacking up here. This is the kind of meeting space in the center for seminar, we'll call it kind of seminar rooms. Office in the top floor with a kind of custom glass desk that Serpik can write on. I've never seen her write on it yet, but she will. And a kind of roof deck. And this is they did a piece in the Dallas Morning News about the project, and the whole piece was written about this elevator, which is kind of funny. But this is a product that you can buy. It's a pneumatic elevator that operates like a thing at the bank that you send your checks to, and so it meant to kind of retrofit people with less mobility, or as mobility changes in a home, you can like retrofit a home with it. But we like turned it into this kind of spectacle in the project, and kids like to ride. Everybody likes to ride it. And so there's a lot of idiosyncratic moments. I mean, Paul mentioned this idea of surprise, and we certainly have a lot of little surprising moments in this project. This is something we call the kind of nook or the kind of ovum in the project. It's an idea that we concocted with Serpik, that maybe there could be a space that you could retreat off the main seminar space and have a meeting with just one or two people. It's made with like handmade plaster, and we actually collaborated with a local artist that builds sculptures that look like ships. And we CNC the framework, but then the local artisan actually constructed the plaster form around it, and it is like a little cocoon that you can kind of go in and have a meeting and read a book in. This is the gallery that supports the media, that has a space for a kitchen, so they can support receptions, a little balcony. They had a performance art on the day the project opened that actually portrayed the project under construction, and the performance artist played the architect, and Serpik played herself, and a series of actors played the workers, and then they auctioned off the workers, and it was kind of a surreal experience. I watched it from the top floor looking down, like you were like some sort of ghost watching your own recent terror. Those of you that have finished a building on a punch list or a tight schedule know what you're rewatching. But the artist had kind of lived on the site during that experience and was kind of remaking that experience in a very dramatic way. But these balconies, my point is, these balconies became places for spotlights and sound and in ways in which you can support the kind of performance art. And then, so this is the more traditional gallery in the front, where these cuts or these windows actually create a kind of openness and bring in a kind of very soft, it's hard to tell in this image, but a very soft kind of rich ambient light. And when you zoom out, you can begin to see that actually this is the context, right? This is an abandoned lot next door. The building was actually torn down while we were designing this and became a kind of gravel lot. The kind of back of this apartment building. This is a neon sign store that happens to be next door. And so for us, wonder is the term here. For us, it's very interesting that surprise is like something that ties us together as a group. But for us, this idea of inserting the kind of surprise in the kind of ordinary, using these materials like hardy board and stucco, and trying to tweak them a little bit to produce a kind of surprise is something that we're always invested in our projects. And so you get moments like this. This is this kind of eruption of a kind of iceberg-like geologic form that is in the kind of backside of the project. And another tool we use to explore these things, this is a kind of quad tick, where you can see we take, these are found objects or photographers we admire like Louis Baltz, and we juxtapose them with our work to try to look for these kind of associations that can help us see our work anew, because this idea of blankness is something that is something that's kind of terrifying as maybe you start a project, or when I say a project, when you start a practice. The idea of blankness is like a kind of shared terror that maybe many of you are familiar with. But then there's a moment where it's actually hard to recover that notion of blankness, and you kind of wish you had that idea of blankness. And so we're always looking for these ways in which you can see things anew. And so here you can see the actual context. This is a building where they used to make maps across the street, and how we actually try to work with these kind of taut or kind of maybe more blank forms to construct our own kind of context. And so, for us, I think the idea of being able to talk to you guys today about what's emerging in our practice, or the idea that we're emerging or emerged, or I don't know what the word means exactly. But through the idea of blankness for us was kind of interesting because, as Rosalyne mentioned in the introduction, the idea of the blank page for us is something we've thought a lot about, and how we construct that, and turning that from the blank page to an idea of blanking that is something that is recoverable and emergent in the work, and maybe redeployed from some kind of universal to these kind of specific moments, is something that's become, I think, important to us in our conversation. And this has been a really kind of amazing and important opportunity for us to reflect on that in the recent trajectory of our work. So thank you. It's been an honor.